Now let's start creating some features for our application. Now we can go about doing this in many different ways. The way I like to do is to separate the features into its own module. Like this you keep it organized and you also avoid creating too many components inside your app folder, which can be very annoying after your application starts to grow and you have a lot of components. And to do that, let's open up the terminal. I'll be using the Angular CLI, but if you check out the Ionic, we're going to use the command generate to generate our templates. If you do -H, you can see all the options available with the generate. You have the types, you can create pages, components, service, modules, everything. And you basically type generate and the type of template you want to create and the name of it. You can also add it under folders, which you're going to be using now. With the Angular it goes the same way, generate -H, and you have all the schematics available. And here, because we created our application using the Ionic CLI, it added this schematic for us, the page, which is particular for an Ionic application. If you're used to an Angular application, we don't have that in it. We basically use you create a component and you link that to a URL. Now, if you take a look at the Ionic framework documentation, and down here under lifecycle, see Angular. In Angular, we have the ng on init and ng on destroy. This is basically when the component starts and when the component closes. And with the Ionic page, you have the ion view enter, did leave, and will leave as well. But this is particular for the Ionic application. Some components require it. We'll see a bit later in this course, but for example, some components won't load your data if you add it on the ng on init. You would have to add it either on the view will enter or did enter, but we'll see more on that later. Now let's go back in here. I'm going to use ng generate. You can use G for short, and we're going to create a module. Just module like that, or you can just do M as well for short. I'm going to call it post. And this creates a folder with a module inside. It's just a basic class. Now let's create some components inside that folder. ng generate. Now we're going to do a page. And it's under post. And I'm going to call it post list. And this command will create a bunch of files plus update our routing. Take a look in here, we have this new entry, the post list. Now I'm gonna also add another component called detail. And this is basically a master view detail. You basically have a list of items, and then when you click on one, it shows the detail of it. So now we have these two entries on our app routing, our main route. You could leave these routes over here, but it's also nice to keep everything compartmentalized inside your post module. So we're gonna remove this from here and we're gonna add it in here under our post module. To do that, we need to import routes and router module from Angular. And we're first gonna create an array of URL. So const routes, which is the type of routes. And now we can go back to our routing module and cut it from here, and we can paste inside here. We also need to change this, because right now from here was look inside the folder to find the files. Now we are in the root of that post, so we can remove this post from here. And now it's going to look into these components and look for the post detail module. And for the namings, I'm going to call it, leave it here empty, and I explain why in a bit. And for the detail page, we need to get some kind of information about this post, and we're going to get it from the URL by adding the ID over here. If you're using islogs or something, you can add anything here you want, and then just ask for it after. But we're gonna be using the ID to identify the posts. Now we just need to initialize this route array, and we can do inside our imports with the router module dot for child, and we pass that routes array. Next thing we need to do is to tell our main route about this file and about this route. So we go back to the routes, and here we can just add a new entry and the path. Here I'm gonna call it blog, and the reason why I'm putting over here instead of here is because by adding your top level URL names inside the main router, you can just simply have one file where you can change all your URLs without going into these folders and adding on each one. So whenever someone reaches this path, it's gonna look to the children of this router, and here we're gonna need to specify the post module. So inside the post folder and the module, we have the post folder here, and then the post module.ts, and we need to tell them about this, the name of the class. And you do that by adding the hash and then the class name. So whenever someone hits this router, this URL, it's gonna load this file, and then this file we have these children routes, which are these ones. For the blog, we'll load this one because it's the empty one. And then if there's an ID, it's gonna load with that ID. Now let's start our server and try it out. Now here in our application, we have it straight on the home route. If you add blog, we have our post list, and then if you add some ID over here, we get the post detail. Later, we're gonna add this ID dynamically from some data from Firebase, but our routes is working. So now let's add the entry here on the side menu so we can have a quick access to the blog page. And we're also gonna add some placeholder for both list and detail. Back in our coding editor, just gonna minimize the terminal, and we can close this too. So first let's add the component entry over here. It's a new entry with a title. The URL is blog, and the icon, I'll add the paper icon. Now by using Ionic, we have access to the Ionicons. You can take a look at the Ionicons website, and here there's a list that comes included in your application with some icons. This is the one I'm using, paper. So now if you take a look on our application, we have our blog here on the side menu. The home and our blog. We also need to add this menu button so we can easily open it. And to do that, I'm just gonna copy it from the home page. Here on the header, when we create an Ionic page, we have three basic components for top level sessions. We have an Ion header, content, and you also have an Ion footer, which will display at the bottom of the page. The header is always on top, and the content will take all the space in between. Here we're using the toolbar, and inside the toolbar we have title, and these Ion buttons. This basically it's a component that will hold other components inside, which you can put them either on the beginning before the title or at the end of the page. So I prefer to use the Ionic button at the end, so I'm gonna move it here below the title, and I'm gonna change it for end. And now I'm gonna copy this and I'm gonna paste this one inside the post list HTML, just under the title. I'm gonna paste it, and I'm also gonna change the title in here for blog. Now if you take a look at our page, you have here on the side now, and also blog, the title is changed, and you have our item over here, our menu. So here inside our Ion content, we're gonna add an Ion grid, which allows us to do some responsive coding, and we can display a nice Ion card with our blog details. So the Ion grid works by adding the main level, which is the Ion grid, and then Ion row, and inside an Ion column. Now for each column, we're gonna display one card. Here's gonna be our content inside. So it's gonna be an Ion card. We're gonna have an Ion image as well at the top. And the image, I'm just going to use the default that came with Ionic, which is these shapes over here. So source, assets, shapes, .svg. Now we can do Ion card header, and inside you have Ion card subtitle, which I'm just gonna add posted by 2 minutes ago. And again, all of this is gonna be dynamic from Firebase after. This is just a placeholder. And title. Now after the header, we can have content. Ion card content. And here I'm just gonna do a simple paragraph. Now this is our basic card. We can save it and take a look at the page. There you go, we have our blog over here. Back in our code, on our Ion column, I'm gonna add the size of 12. And 12 is the maximum size of a grid. And for now, let's do size SM. And we're also gonna need to copy it a few times so we can see what's going on. All the column. So this row, you're gonna have multiple column. Now when it's loaded, we have all our posts over here. And as you can see, it's taking all the space whenever it's in a different size, but when you reach the mobile phone, which is the SM, it's gonna start to trickle down into, this is the 12, which we added over here. If you were to change that for 6, on all of them, I'll just use the search and replace, now it's 6, and you save. Whenever you reach the small size, our grid is gonna have 2 items, because the grid is based on 12. If you use half, you have 2 of each. Now, if you change that to a different, instead of SM over here, you're to use, I'm gonna use the search and replace again. Let's say LG. Now it changed all of them to LG. Now when you reach the LG size, the breakpoint, which is there about 1000 pixels, it will change from 6 to the maximum amount of cards. So you can play around with this. I'll show you now the documentation. Still under guides, and if you go to responsive grid, layout responsive grid, here's our breaking points that we're using, the LG 960 and the default breaking points. This is what we used over there, the size LG. You can also offset. If you scroll all the way down, you can see that there is some other configurations that you can do. You can change the padding. For example, here the default is 5 pixels. If you take a look at our application, this is the gap over here in between the page, the cards. To change that, you can just add the ion grid on your post list.css, ion grid, and change this padding over here to, instead of using 5 pixels, let's say 0. And when you save it, you already have a smaller gap in between your components. Now back to our post list. When you add the size without a breaking point, that's the smaller breaking point. So I'm going to change it here for 12 again. All of them. Now in our component, it's going to be one line only when you reach that. You can add size SM, and then you can change how it's going to look like when in the size LG. You can also add in here, let's say 3, which is going to display 4 cards. Then you need to change all of the other ones. And whenever you reach the size LG, it's going to show 4. As you can see now, we only have 4. But because we didn't set up the median or the smaller grid, it displays the default again. So we should put the default for all of them. When you reach the smaller mobile device, it's going to be 1. So here on the LG, you're displaying 4. If you were to change this one to display MD for medium, and you change all of them again, we're going to have the median size as well. Now back in our code, back in our application, we're still showing 4 on the median because I didn't change in there. So let's add in here 4. So we'll show 3 blog posts, 3 cards, and you have the small, the medium, and when you reach over the LG breaking point, you have 4. So basically this is how you set up some responsive grid. Right now you have the 4 in the large, 3 cards in the middle, and when you go to the smaller one, you have the 1. But here we still have this breaking point that shows all the maximum there. And you have this gap in between, which you can fix by adding, let's say on the SM, let's add a grid of 6, so it will display 2 cards, 3 cards, and 4 cards. Now we're doing this manually, but after we're only going to have one column over here and everything else is going to be dynamic. So this is just so we can check it out how the grid works. Now as you can see, you have one for the default with the default size, the 12. Now when you grow up a bit, it's going to have 2, which is the 6. And then when you grow a bit more, 3. And then 4. You can also add for the XL, which is the latest one in here. But this is basically how we could do a nice dynamic blog post. We didn't add for this one, that's why it looks a bit different. So now let's add a link over here. When someone clicks one of these blog posts, it will take them to the detail page. And that can be easily done by adding a router link inside here, our card. Router link. And then we can just tell like go to blog and then some post ID. Now back in here in our application, if you click, you go to the post detail. And here at the top we have the blog and the post ID. So it's working properly. Now we can remove all of these other ones in here, these other entries, because you're not going to be using it anymore. So now we have only ion grid, ion row, and one column inside. If you were to add feature blogs, you would add another row, and that would be working independently than this row. Whatever, no matter how many columns would be inside this one, we would display these ones and then the next row. Now before we go to our detail page, let's add some CSS so we can change the size of this image. And you can do that on our post list.css. Here let's create a class called postcard, and we're going to target the image, ion image. Now you can say the max height, and let's say 35 VH, view height, and we're also gonna do an overflow hidden, so the image slides under the card details, card contents. Now we just need to tag our card with this class. Back in our post list page, you can just do class, and then add here postcard. Now when you load, our image should be smaller now. And here on the smaller screen, you can see that the image will slide under it instead of shrinking and getting misshaped. Right, now when you click, let's do the post detail and to finish up this module. And close everything. And here under the content, I'm just going to add the same as we did before, the menu bar. So I'm gonna copy it from here. And it's under the title. Here's gonna be, after we're gonna include the post name. And let's add as well a back button, because right now when you go to the post, we don't have a way to go back unless you open up the menu, but that's not a good way to do it. So here we're gonna add a back button menu, ion back button. Now this back button is a little bit tricky because right now, as you can see, we don't have a button over there, and that's because Ionic works with a navigation stack. The stack is basically your history where the user navigated to and from, and then it can have that information and allow the back button to work. So if you refresh your page here now and you click it, you have a back button here, and that's because I left in here as an end. So we need a start. So let's go back and do it again. And if you click, you can see that the back button is there. But if in a case the user is coming out using a link to this blog post, and go to your website straight to the post, you won't have the navigation, so that button is not going to work. Or if the user reload, the button is not going to work because there is no navigation stack. What you can do to fix that is to add a default URL. But before we do that, let's take a look at the documentation. If you go under components and you go to navigation or toolbar, here at the bottom, Ion back button. And if you scroll all the way to the properties, you have a default href. And this is what is going to show in case there is no stack. And this is very important to do, because if the user gets to your page and from here, he only going to have this menu here, and it doesn't look nice at all as a user experience point of view. So let's add the default URL. We know that is a blog post, so let's add, send them back to blog. So it always, even if you refresh now, it's always going to be there and take them to the blog post. Now this is a good way to do it when you know which page they are going to. But later on, we're going to see how we can do that using the Angular location library. So we're always going to have the browser default back button, not our application button. Now for the content, I'm just going to copy the one from the list, the card, and I'm going to paste in here. Scroll, remove the class and the URL. And for now, we're just going to leave it like this. If you go back to the page, you have our post over here. Click from the list, detail page.